Good afternoon. I'm Eric Schmitt with the New York Times. I wanted to welcome you all to the CNAS event here, talking about the National Defense Strategy, specifically the Commission's report on that. And we're going to have a good, lively debate, I hope, up here today among the panelists and others who are involved in creating the strategy itself. And I'll just briefly go down and introduce folks before we kick things off. I think the format will be here. I'll tee up some questions, but I really want this to be a discussion among the panelists, the distinguished panelists we have up here today. And we'll go for about an hour or so, speaking up here among ourselves, and then we're going to throw it open to you all for questions the last 30 minutes or so. So start getting those questions ready, and we'll get to you then. Just for brief introductions, I mean, many of the folks here you are well recognized, I think, to everybody. Starting on the far left, of course, is Bob Work, the former Deputy Defense Secretary, now Senior Advisor. Here we have Roger Zakheim, who's the Washington Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute. Kathleen Hicks, Senior Vice President and Director of the International Security Program at CSIS. Andy Krepinevich, President and COO of Solarium. And Elbridge Colby, who's the Director of Defense Programs here at CNAS and was a lead official in the development and rollout of the National Defense Strategy. I'm going to start with a question to Roger, as a member of the Commission.
Always picking on the young guy.
Yeah, I know. And really wanted to kind of tee things up a little bit for the discussion here, and just to kind of review for everybody here. I think you're familiar with not only the strategy, but the Commission's report on it. And I think what I did in my article for the New York Times and kind of summarizing the lead was the Commission basically concluded this was a great strategy, but often relied too heavily on questionable assumptions and weak analysis, and questioned whether their resources were really going to be behind this, whether there was going to be a commitment going forward, this administration, on to really follow through on the National Defense Strategy. So Roger, if you could kind of tee up, I mean, I obviously just barely summarize things, but tee up for you some of the main points that you all go in, and I think we'll jump in from there.
Great, just awesome to be with this group. Thanks, Bridge, for letting me join, and great to see so many friends in the audience here. The way I would characterize the Commission, I mean, we pretty much consensus early on. They thought the defense strategy got it right, particularly on the big things. And the biggest one is, of course, China. And saying that is the pacing threat, and therefore first order of business for the Department of Defense is to orient the entire force strategy towards China, and then afterwards figure out, all right, how do we deal with the others? And of course, order, Russia, and you go on down, Iran, North Korea, terrorism. It was the next piece of it, which was, okay, to what extent is the defense strategy and really the Department of Defense, and this is kind of gleaning from the various briefings that we're able to participate in, to what extent is the department kind of ready to execute and has a framework in place to execute the strategy? Because, and you see the language at the start of the report, the view of the commissioners was, we are at a significant moment. What I think many of the commissioners want to call a national security crisis, a national emergency, actually was language that was first proposed. So it came down to, all right, are we capable, are we ready, do we have a framework for executing? And there is where the commission spent most of its time, and as you see in the report, the conclusion was, we are not positioned to execute against the strategy. And then you hit on your question a number of those concerns. But that's the context. We are not ready to execute, and the time couldn't be worse, right? There could be more at stake, and I'll just conclude with this. Resources didn't feel that the strategy or the department was positioning itself to execute against the strategy. I'm happy to expand upon that if you're interested. Second, the analytical framework that's required, right, to go ahead and figure out, one, how do you deter a China? Or how do you fight and beat a China was really not something that we felt the department had a framework in terms of how to go about doing it. And then, that kind of gets to this, the force itself, right? What do we want to fight with? what kind of force do we need, of course, also seem to be pretty underdeveloped. And so when you have this great strategy, but this gap in terms of what you do next, that was pretty striking. And I think that's where you see most of the Commission's work focused. It's pretty high level. I'm happy to jump into any of that or defer to some of their commissioners to comment.
Right. Bob Work, can you address some of the gaps? And if so, is this is the team you've left behind there, at least the remainders of that team and their successors, are they up to the task? And is this administration committed to this?
Well, I want to get back to that question, but I'd like to say something about the Commission itself. I did not find it that helpful. First of all, I thought it way overstates the problem. I mean, we are nowhere near a national security emergency or a national security crisis. This is much more like us coming out of Vietnam, and we have fought a long war, and we turn our gaze to our great power competitor, and we say, whoa, this great power competitor has really gotten stronger while we've been at war. Conventional deterrence is going down. What are we going to do about it? We're in a long-term competition. And so rather than calling it a crisis, we are in a long-term competition. That's what the National Defense Strategy says. And there was a lot of talk about, hey, lack of concepts. I just want to roll you back to 1975. The first operational concept that the Army rolled out was called active defense. And it was an utter bust. I mean, it didn't make any sense operationally, and the Army itself rejected it. And within 2 years, they went to air-land battle. In a period of rapid technological change, your operational concepts are not yet set. And the last place you would find them is in a national defense strategy. So this is my biggest complaint, and I'm anxious to get into the debate. And I've had this, let me just say,
don't hold back, Bob.
I know everybody on the Commission. I respect every single one of them, but this is a feeling that I've had of every national commission since the end of the Cold War. The first thing you ask is, are the ends consistent with the national security environment we find ourselves in? And the Commission says yes, with one big caveat that I'll come back later. The force sizing construct. They said it should be a two-war construct. That's a big, big change. Second, then, are your ends consistent with the means? And the Commission either can say yes, generally yes, but here are different choices we would make, or no. And the first role of the strategy to help the department and Congress is, how would you then change the ends to align with the means? In other words, just asking for more money is pretty easy. I mean, anybody in here could say, hey, if you had $200 billion more per year, what would you do? Well, I'd get a bigger Army, I'd get a bigger Navy, I'd get a bigger Air Force, I'd get a bigger Marine Corps, everybody would be happy, we'd all go home, and we'd be able to buy hypersonics, and we'd be able to go, oh, God, it'd be so great. And that's generally the way I read the Commission. It was, okay, your ends are correct. We don't think your means align to your ends. They don't give any guidance to the department on how you would adjust your ends to the means. Instead, it's let's change our means to align with the ends. This reminded me very much of the interwar period, say around 1928, 1929, asking the Navy, hey, if we gave you another $100 billion, what would you do? And they'd buy battleships and scout cruisers and a bunch of obsolete airplanes. So to me, I came here ready to fight. So here I am. And the other thing is I want to riff off something that Andy...
There's something else?
Andy Krepinevich put this out, and this is very important. Since 1885, the United States has never faced a competitor or group of competitors with a GDP greater than 40% of our own. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was about 40%. China has already surpassed us in purchase power parity, and if things continue to go, they'll surpass us in absolute terms of GDP by 2030. You're not going to outspend your way out of this problem. you have got to completely change. And so, again, channeling Andrew, hey, you can bust the chops of the department for not having operational concepts, but then you can't say, let's spend $100 billion more and not give the concepts that would drive it there.
I'm going to turn to Kath as another commission member to kind of defend this completely unrealistic report that you gave. Go ahead, Kath.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I was unaware walking in that the strength of the viewpoint. I certainly greatly respect Bob as an important voice in the conversation on defense. I think the commission, it's all in how you read it. And that's one of the realities as somebody who's been on a few commissions. I'm just going to pause there to say I'm recalling now Tony Cordesman when I left CSIS the first time. Somebody already knows where I'm going. Has that great quote about if God really hates you, he'll make you work on a QDR. And I read that as I was sitting there having to work on the 2010 QDR, which was probably my fourth QDR. And now I'm thinking if God really hates you, you also have to then work on a commission about the QDRs because no one ever, it's not a place where you're going to get a lot of love. So my particular reading of the commission report and how it got me on board, and I'm going to speak for myself, is by being very careful in its language in the report itself about resourcing and the order of the argumentation, which is, let me just say, and very important to me, we do make a lot of hay about how the department fights is the bigger question, and all my writing before and after the commission report continues that theme. So that's where I'm coming from. Where I think the commission makes an important contribution is to frame the argument, whereas former commissions had force structure tables that were frankly unrealistic and backed with little analysis. They made arguments very strongly on the capacity side and the resource side, sort of more. I thought what we tried to do here was come to consensus in a town that can't come to consensus on anything around the idea that it's not going to be just money. As a matter of fact, we say that explicitly. And it's probably not just going to be concepts. It's about how you transform the department for the challenge set that we face. Whatever you want to call that, whether someone calls it a crisis or an emergency, or just as we say in the report, that we are falling behind in terms of the speed with which others are adapting much more quickly than us. I think you agree with that. I think that's what I heard, is that you agree that the Chinese are adapting. So I'm not here to rumble, but I will say I think there's a lot that we can come together around, and the department, I think we were very kind to the department. I hope they accept that, accept that we were coming from a place of saying you're going in the right direction, and that in and of itself is a huge push for Democrats and Republicans across the span to be able to come around and say these are the priorities, but we have got to get on how we transform the institution. And for some people, they wanted very much to make the case that for the NDS, as it is spelled out, as best we can read it in both classified and unclassified form, there's very little analysis to support how it actually achieves its objectives. We're not clear on whether the force can do what it claims to do. We don't argue for a two-war construct, by the way. And we have a lot of concerns about the resourcing picture as it's laid out as being supportive of that strategy as spelled out. I think that that's accurate. I think we have a lot of concerns about that. Whether you fix that by just adding means, that is not something that the Commission recommends. It's a to-be-debated, clearly here, space that we're in today.
Roger, you want to jump in quickly, but then I want to go to Andy and Bridge.
It's a rumble now. So,
yeah.
Because I'm more motivated. And my niceties at the outset, jettisoning.
Bring it on.
I'm going to hit on two things real quick. All right. First, the not a crisis. I think we really do ourselves harm by kind of poo-pooing it or saying this is something 2 generations away from dealing with. I think the evidence there is the facts on the ground that are changing every day. I heard Frank Kendall say something last week, which I thought was spot on, which is his biggest fear is not whether we go to war with China. His biggest fear is when China goes ahead and takes that next bit of territory that belongs to an ally or friend or partner, and we do nothing about it. And the reality is that time and time again, over the past year, 2, 3 years, we've done nothing about it. Actually, you go back to Georgia, to South Ossetia and Abkhazia, when we started not doing anything. It's a bipartisan problem, and that's why I think it's a crisis. That's number one, to the friend to my left. Number two, all right, on resources. Okay, the reality is that we thought the ends of the national defense strategy were spot on. The money is not there to support that. What Bob Work is saying right now is that he wants a different defense strategy. That's fine. But if you want to accomplish what this defense strategy sets out to do, which in this first sentence that Bridge Colby wrote, or gave the first version, I don't know what happened.
Yeah, so much for a lot.
If the U.S. will remain the preeminent military power in the world, and you're not going to be remaining preeminent in Asia, in Europe, the Middle East, and every other in the regional world which is challenging us, absent resources which are 3 to 5% growth that Jim Mattis and General Dunford called for based on the strategy that you wrote. And I think you would agree that the strategy that Bridge wrote is far more aggressive and ambitious than the one that you sponsored when you were Deputy Secretary of Defense. I don't know how you talk about anything less than what this commission put forward in terms of what's required for resources.
All right, I'm going to go to Andy because he's been scribbling furiously over here. And while he sat on the commission, he also did not necessarily agree with everything the commission said. So I wanted to get in, Andy, where you differ from your colleagues. And
I'm scribbling here. Get Bob Work after this. I guess a couple of observations. First, I think we can all agree that one of the big contributions of the National Defense Strategy is to understand, make the point that we're no longer in an era where we're seeking collective security, that we've been in and we are in now great power, balance of power politics. And you can see that going back to the Wilsonian period, after every major war, after World War I, we have the League of Nations and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. After World War II, we have the Four Policemen. After the Cold War, we have cooperative security and partnership for peace. And there's always this attempt to say, can we all just get along? And I think the period after the Cold War lasted so long because our advantage was so great, and we didn't realize that others kind of got along with us because they had no choice. And I think it was a very helpful statement in this national defense strategy to say that we are in a great power competition. It's the Chinese and it's the Russians. And so, again, I want to give voice to that. As far as some of the things that Bob Work said, I think Roger kind of alluded to it. We have a strategic choice to make. Are we going to scale back on the ends that we seek? And these are ends that we've sought for basically a century. We went into World War I to maintain, to prevent the establishment of a hegemonic power in Europe. We fought World War II to prevent that from occurring in Europe or in Asia. Same with the Cold War. If we're going to give up on that enduring strategic interest, which I think indirectly would threaten ourselves, our own security in this hemisphere, that's an incredibly important strategic choice that we have to make. I would try to avoid making that choice of abandoning those enduring interests, if at all possible. And I do think we have the means to do that. If you look at Bob's point about are we or are we not in an emergency, I think if you look, for example, at the situation we confronted in the late 40s and early 50s, the last time we called out other great powers as major rivals, which was in 47 with President Truman and the Soviet Union, you see that it was certainly viewed as an emergency then. If you look at our competitive position now, let's talk about the various dimensions of strategy. So you have the economic dimension. During the Cold War, and let's go back to the period right after Vietnam, which Bob cites as, we're sort of in this period. Well, I would say, no, we're not in this period. The Soviet Union was at the beginning of a rapid decline. China is nowhere near the beginning of a rapid decline. We are on the cusp of a Reagan defense buildup. There's no such buildup in sight. In fact, if we had an enormous advantage in terms of our allies and the kind of resources they were putting into defense. If there's a disarmament race going on today, our allies are winning. And so, as previous administrations, including this one in its own unique way, have made the point. So if you look at, and as Bob said himself, the Chinese have about 2/3 our GDP as measured in terms of the current exchange rates. If you want to add the Russians to that, it's about 80% of our GDP. Now, that's twice, at least in terms of that metric, the fundamental ability to generate military power, military potential. Okay, so. In the economic dimension, trends are not favorable. In the technical dimension, one of the reasons, and Bob cited this when he talked about his offset strategies, the first and the second one were predicated on a huge advantage we had in technology relative to the Soviet Union. We're losing that advantage rapidly to China. Read the current issue of The Economist, and you'll see just how dicey our situation is. At the operational dimension, how we apply these resources, it strikes me that this was a particularly strong shortcoming of the national defense strategy in that it doesn't even list the operational challenges, first of all. Second of all, the panel wasn't really looking for, this is the doctrine, this is air-land battle and the outer air battle. We were looking for some sense of how the department was going to address the requirements for, say, defending our allies along the first island chain in East Asia. Absent some understanding, there's no way you can establish defense priorities and program priorities. So, again, that left us really adrift in terms of the analysis that we thought was necessary to come to those kinds of conclusions.
Okay, Andy, I'm going to let Bob respond briefly, but before that, I want to get to Bridge because China obviously keeps coming up.
And I don't want this to be beating up on Bob because I essentially 100% agree.
You can beat up on Bridge
so you
too.
You can beat up on both of us. And let me just say, bring it on. Bring it on. All right, Bob doesn't need me. But this was the purpose of this event? Was I think the Commission has rightly gotten a tremendous amount of attention, and I think Bob and I certainly are very laudatory about the most of it, and I'll touch on that briefly. But the idea here, in front of this kind of audience, and for those who are going to watch online, was to get at the real issues, which, have, as far as I can tell, have not really come out in the public discussion of the Commission report, but really are the guts of what the future defense strategy debate is about. And that's why we really wanted to have this, and I'm delighted that it's touched off. So well done. I think, Bob, I don't want to speak for you, but I certainly thought that the Commission's strong signal of urgency, which the strategy says as well, its endorsement of the focus on great power competition, its candor about the danger in the critical theaters, say over a Taiwan or a Baltic scenario. These are not only excellent in many respects; they are critically needed, and actually an improvement over some of the other things that aren't happening that should be. But I think that at that level, in the alignment of the strategic priority and the clarity of and the urgency of the issue, the Commission is really helpful and important. My frustration with the Commission is that I think the question in the defense space then starts there, which is, Andy, everything that you've said, I think I agree with. I imagine Bob probably agrees with it too. That just gives me more urgency and focus on making hard choices. And that's with a defense budget of what we have now, or a defense budget that's 100 or 200 billion more. That the scale of the challenge posed by China in particular is so urgent that we need to make hard choices. And that's where I was frustrated with the Commission's report, because I think it calls for capacity growth across the force, if I understand correctly. I believe it, I can't quote chapter and verse, but I believe it calls for most, if not all, of the services. It caps reductions in presence and posture in the Middle East. And basically, and I think that's a step back from the National Defense Strategy, particularly what Secretary Mattis did, and Deputy Secretary Shanahan, then now Acting Secretary Shanahan, and then Deputy Secretary Work in his capacity in the early stages, which was to really give a strategy that not only had a clear sense of the priority, but also what to do less of. And I think that's really novel. And I think it's very important in particular because, and my colleague Susanna Bloom used to help Bob run the DMAG, but I think when you get down to the real business of what the Pentagon is doing, which is a purchasing organization, it essentially is saying, this is what you don't have to do. And that decision has to be made at the high political level, because a 2-star Army general or a 2-star Navy admiral on the program and budget review is not the person who's going to say, I can cut this political sacred cow or buy fewer of these or not do this kind of mission. And what the NDS was really saying is, we are going to do less. And Secretary Mattis was assuming that responsibility along with Deputy Secretary Shanahan to do less, to focus on making sure that the Americans and our allies can win the major war before we resource for simultaneity. I think it had a clarity on that, and that's where I thought that the Commission, I would think, Andy, that you would be sympathetic to that as well, but I think that's the key point.
Well, one of the problems is the NDS doesn't even establish which of the two great powers is the principal threat. And the European and the Western Pacific theater are two very different theaters, two different kinds of adversaries. Strategy is about choosing. It's about setting priorities. The NDS doesn't even set a priority. Now, my clear priority is China, but I would say that's point one. Point two is the Commission does not have the time or the resources to do the kind of analytic work to say you ought to be, this should be the operational concept, and this calls for so many F-35s and a base here. We simply don't have the analytic capability. Now, we could have had the ability, if the strategy had included those kinds of, that kind of analysis, to make some judgments, but to say that the Commission should undertake the kind of detailed analysis that would allow us to provide specific programmatic recommendations, I think is just beyond the capacity of the Commission.
Roger, you have a quick point to make, then I want to go to...
Somebody bring the Festivus poll for the airing of the grievances now? I'm just wondering.
2 points. One on the Middle East, to respond to what Bridge said. The Commission came out and made essentially, I guess we thought we were standing behind what the department put forward, which was, got to remain committed in the Middle East, but we got to change the way we do business there, which is essentially the briefing we got on the NDS. To Andy's point, other than telling us that we shouldn't be using F-35s and we got to come up with light air attack aircraft, there was no real development of what that meant. And to date, the department hasn't been able to articulate how kind of maintaining what we do in the Middle East, just do it differently and more efficiently. I mean, it's just an idea. You can't actually put any meat on that bone. That's a huge problem. That's a reflection of what the Commission was struggling with. One other thing about force structure and analysis. So, originally, I think that the Commission, and certainly I was, somewhat reticent to put forward force structure recommendations and arguments about capacity. But then I saw how the department came up with its number, right, in terms of the means that would be required to accomplish the ends, and it made the back of the envelope math that we did in the Armed Services Committee look sophisticated by comparison. At that point, I'm like, screw it, we can do this, right, and we should put forward our own force structure recommendations, have a sense in terms of what's required to be done based on historical pieces. Ultimately, my view didn't prevail, and I didn't get my colleagues, the commissioners, to agree.
Well, when you present it like that, it doesn't matter.
But I have to tell you, I mean, it goes to the point on the analysis is that I found it pretty underwhelming in terms of the department could put forward, even just to justify the strategy that it put on paper.
Can I just sorry, Eric. Well, no, because I think, let me be clear. I actually personally agree with a lot of the criticisms of the department, including the lack of progress on operational concepts and that the department has not figured out how to do the Middle East. The Commission was absolutely right, and there are a couple other issues that the Commission really rightly. So we're trying to find problems here to have an interesting debate and clarify the key issues. But you're absolutely right that the department is behind on really implementing. I think Bob and I wrote a piece in the Washington Post in the fall saying this is supposed to be a masterpiece budget. We're supposed to be there are high expectations. So let's see what 20 looks like. The budget's not the only thing, but that's a huge signal with high expectations.
Yes, let me just say that the original thinking was that Bridge would start off and say we agree with the Commission on the fact that the great power competition is there. So I was going to then come in behind him, but without that introduction, let me just say
that didn't quite play out.
Everyone agrees that we're moving into great power competition. It was good that the Commission endorsed the department's view. I believe the department has been clear. I'd have to go back and reread. I know in the classified version, well, let me not say that.
Quite like that.
Let me just say that.
Bob, go ahead.
Do we have a delay on the recording?
Let me just say that Secretary Shanahan, in his first meeting with the Defense Writers Group, said China, China, China. There's no question that China is the #1 competitor that the Department of Defense is focused on, and it sees Russia as more of a near-term challenge. Now, I go back to, I do believe this is much like at the end of the Vietnam War, because we did not know that the Soviet Union had started its precipitous decline until well after that point. When we came out of Vietnam, we were absolutely horrified at the conventional balance in Europe. I remember the Army saying, you know, the slogan at the time was fight outnumbered and win. And we were trying to develop the operational concepts to allow us to do that. We were going to own the night. There was an awful lot of churn going on. And it was a long, you know, we still thought we were in a long-term competition. And the key point here is all of the things that we bought in the Reagan defense buildup were designed when money was at its lowest in the Carter administration. So the flash to bang to modernization, when Reagan said, let's turn on the spigot, was really quick. We bought, you know, the A-1, the tanks were there, the Bradley fighting vehicles were there, the A-10s, the F-16, everything had already been designed, and away we went. Here's the key point that I would say that I think we're all arguing about. You can execute this national defense strategy at $700 billion a year, without question, if you make the right choices. You can completely screw up the strategy at $800 billion a year if you make the wrong choices. So I think what we're all saying is, it's about the choices that the department would make. Dave Ochmonek has convinced me that if we just came out and just said, we will have the capability within 10 years to sink 350 ships in the Western Pacific in 72 hours and destroy 2,400 tanks in 72 hours. We could do that. And we could do it on $700 billion. All it would take is a major change. So if you, and I would just say, a two-war force-sizing construct makes more strategic sense today than at any previous point in the post-Cold War era. So it sounded to me like you wanted a two-war strategy. The key point is, what are the choices the department's going to make? And they don't, they're struggling, they're debating this right now. And so hopefully we'll see what the choices are in the 20 program. But I expect we'll probably see it in the 21 now.
Kath, I think you wanted to
yeah, I just want to
here.
footstock that point. Again, I write on this as well frequently. It's not about how much, it's about how. We have to figure out the how. And the challenge the department faces right now, and let's not even talk about the masterpiece 2020, the 2019 budget, the 2018 budget, the budgets we looked at as the commission, the budgets everyone can see today. It is not clear what the theory of the case is for how we operationalize this strategy. It's not clear in the investment portfolio. It's not clear in the terms of the justification documents. And it does look just like more of the same. And if you argue for more of the same, it probably would take you to 800 billion, which is not realistic. So I think the first and fundamental question is, do we think we are at a point in time where others are advancing more quickly on the most important parameters than we are? And if so, how do we transition ourselves? I just want to add one element that hasn't come up, which I suspect is shared by everybody on this stage. The other major piece of the challenge that we face is the multidimensionality of the threats, which are not just coming from China, but very importantly, let's focus on China. This is not just about defense capability. It is about defense capability, but it is also about our alliances, our diplomatic approaches, our economic strategy, our trade strategy, our energy strategy, and we are not building the other elements of power. We are not integrating across elements of power. And how could we possibly hope, if we cannot build any whole of government or whole of society momentum and approach and investment strategy, how could we possibly hope to compete effectively with a country that is doing that? It is investing societally in R&D and other areas.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob. Because obviously this is a point that the Commission makes is hypersonics, AI, China stole on a march on the U.S.
This is all about getting a national strategy, a national competitive strategy for a long-term competition. So both China and Russia are conventionally deterred right now. That's why they're headed into the gray zone. They're operating below the threshold of conventional armed conflict. But I would argue very strongly, and this is one of the things I'd be very interested in hearing, giving that mission to the Department of Defense would be an enormous mistake. You know, you have to think in terms of almost like an OSS type paramilitary Title 50 type thing that would compete in the gray zone. You don't want the gray zone to be a major force structure driver or force design element of this strategy. We will support, so SOF would support, ISR would support, but the last thing you want to do is to give that mission to the Department of Defense simply because we can't get the national strategy right. That's what we seem to do all the time. Well, the Department of Defense can do it, so let's give them the mission. And in a long-term competition, you've got to prioritize in the Department of Defense too. Roger. It really is against China and Russia.
I want to go back to, I agree with what you said in terms of, you need the political, you need the economic piece of the competition. Obviously we focused on is the military side, and it was lacking there too. So whether you're talking about the gray zone or below-level armed conflict, there's stuff for the military to do there. That's necessary. It's not sufficient, but necessary. And we found it lacking in terms of the department's ability to articulate and explain what it needed to accomplish their piece of it. You made a point that you could accomplish a strategy of $700 billion. I just wholly disagree. I don't know how you could accomplish what needs to happen vis-a-vis China, Russia, right, as well as the current fight. Think about Afghanistan. I don't have to worry about Syria anymore. Iran. You know better than anybody else the dollars that go into that. So if you're arguing choices that have to be made and pull out, right, along the lines of what the president's talking about, fine. But that's an entirely different strategy than the one the department put forward. So yes, $800 billion, I think you get closer. $700 billion, no way. And let me get to the undercurrent here, right? There is and to a certain extent, the commission, in my view, was almost paralyzed by the following. You have the competition, which is our new language for talking about what we used to call peacetime. We are constantly in competition with China and Russia, North Korea and Iran, in all these ways. That requires resources, capability, capacity, which, by the way, we're choosing every day where we want to emphasize and where we don't. See the parts where they're kicking our butt because we can only focus on 1 or 2 and not focusing on 3 and 4, right? That's a challenge. And, we have to get ready for a conflict potentially, right? Not to mention the very real concern, which I think was shared across the commission, which was the challenge of near simultaneity. Yes, if you want to go all in and say, we're going to deal with China, as Andy has suggested, or we're going to deal with Russia, and it will be World War III, remember this, right? We'll just go ahead and do just call up. We'll go back to the draft if we get in a situation where someone wants to be a spoiler, named Russia, named North Korea, named Iran, or a terrorist event, then fine. We didn't think the strategy was willing to do that. Nor do we think the strategy should do that. That actually you have to build a force, both in competition and in conflict, that can deal with near simultaneity. That can't get done at $700 billion, and you'd be stressed to do it at $800 billion.
Okay, Bridge, is the strategy supple enough to do that?
Yes. I think what we're dancing around, or not dancing, we're kind of boxing around, is the question of how much risk do we want to take? And this is kind of a Pentagonese sort of term. But, I don't know if Bob would agree, but I think we would benefit from having a higher defense budget. We need to think about in terms of what the American people will bear. Of course, there's a political analysis how likely that is, how much we'll bear, and what's optimal from a long-term societal competitive posture point of view in terms of how much money we want to allocate to defense. I don't think the NDS was actually, it's a strategy that involves a prioritization. You can take less risk at the top, including in secondary and tertiary degrees, or you can take more risk. It's certainly not a strategy that you can do on the cheap. I would definitely agree with Roger in that way. But what the total figure is, for instance, I have no idea what it would be. Now, I think it depends on how much if you were going to do the strategy, you'd knock things out from the bottom of the prioritization table, basically. Now, I think a couple points I think that I think is really important, and actually, a couple points. I think Roger or Kath was saying before the event, look, you got to remember what a commission is, and I've served on the staff of a couple of commissions. They're, like anything, they are designed to do certain things, highlight certain issues. I don't think we're here to nickel and dime every word. Similarly, the National Defense Strategy is a document designed to attain certain ends. Most of the flaws, in fact, I regularly found myself making many of the same kind of comments that the Commission would make within the department that they made on the outside. We have not figured out how we can effectively accomplish the ends that Bob and Dave Ochmanek has just alluded to. We have not figured out how to sustainably compete, etc. These are issues. I think the NDS does actually provide the outlines quite clearly of a way of what we call defeating, red theory of victory. Secretary Mattis was a big fan of Sun Tzu. It's basically kind of going after the adversary strategy. It's a shift away from the Desert Storm model, basically the idea that we will attain dominance in the way that we could against the Iraqis, for instance, and one towards what you might call counter power projection or whatever, but basically designed to credibly defend our alliance network through the kinds of measures that I think Bob was just alluding to, and then push the burden of escalation onto the opponent. And of course, the NPR nests very, very nicely with the NDS in this respect, that the conventional forces are supposed to do the blunting, and the blunting is a really key function laid out in the global operating model of the NDS. And then we have our nuclear forces if, God forbid, the adversary should choose to take it to that level. I think that is the model. It would be wonderful if the department would carry that forward, but I think this is a tough problem. I used to say when I was still in the department that I would envy a lot of the guys who were in uniform, who were, say, 05s or 06s, who have to come up with the next airline battle. I think Bob's point about active defense is really apropos, which is now there's a strategic political military framework that tells us we have to be combat-credible forward forces designed to beat the adversary's theory of victory, and particularly to deny the fait accompli against our alliance members, and I would include Taiwan for all practical purposes, even though it's technically a partner. So I think that's the basic logic. Candidly, not everybody agrees who's in the Department of Defense. Certainly the leadership agreed in the strategy, but that's something that's hard and it's contested because it involves goring sacred cows. But that, I think, what the strategy was designed to do was try to catalyze that. If I could just briefly, I think on the gray zone thing and the seamless integration, I would have a somewhat different view than Kath. I agree, I think, with Bob. I mean, I think we all agree that gray zone is a problem. The issue is military power and the military balance is crucial. And yes, it's going to be across the elements of national power competition, but we have to maintain the military advantage. As Bob said, they're going to the gray zone because they know a fight would not go well. If they can shift the balance, that's going to change things. And what they're going to be trying to do in the gray zone is probably shift the calculus of states in, say, Southeast Asia or East Asia or South Asia, who then will do less with us to make it possible for us to defend each other. I think on the simultaneity issue, this is a big issue. I think we can't talk about it in too much detail, but I think the NDS is very clear that if you win in the decisive theater, you will be able to recover in the others. The most stressing form of this is Russia and China. Probably Russia first, then China, for a variety of reasons. I think there's a way it can be done. That, of course, would, I think, equate to something like World War III. It's something that the department should be prepared for. What exactly that looks like, I think there are ways you could do it. Whether you'd have to call people up, et cetera, is another issue. But I think the other ones, like the Koreas, Iran, and so forth, in a sense, the Desert Storm model still works, particularly against, say, the Irans of the world. So,
Andy, I know you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, I think this is an important point. Roger contested Bob's view about a $700 billion budget being sufficient. Until recently, we had a budget somewhat in that ballpark to deal with the threat of North Korea and Iran and some terrorist groups. That budget essentially, we've had dramatic increases in personnel costs that basically eat out other parts of the budget. If you just read the papers these days, it's starting to look like the readiness crisis, that we saw in the late 70s and arguably again sometime later. If we talk about the fact that technology is moving at a rapid rate, it's not exactly a situation where you can gut your R&D budget and get out of hypersonics and AI and so on. In terms of procurement, the buildup of the 2000s after 9/11 was a hollow buildup in terms of procurement. So we really haven't modernized the force the way that we traditionally have in quite some time. Adding insult to injury, it takes us forever to get anything out into the field. Bob talks about the post-Vietnam era. It took us 3 years to build the F-117. Okay? It took us 5. Well, if you want to, depending upon the starting point, it didn't take us 25. Okay? And time is a resource. And we saw tens of billions of dollars wasted in the early 2000s as program after program was canceled. And then finally, I would say that, so the point is, I don't think you can get it on a $700 billion budget, not even close. Another important factor, the second point I want to make, is unlike the late 70s and early 80s, the American people they're not even conscious of what's going on here. I mean, I have the headline of when Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, big headline across the front page of the New York Times. There was no such headline when the national security strategy or the national defense strategy, it was crickets. And so we don't even have the American people's head in the game. And why is that important? That's important because according to the CBO projections, interest on our debt will go from about $230 billion a couple of years ago to over $800 billion. And that's money that's going to be squeezed out. If you look at entitlements, the march is toward ever-expanding entitlements. You know, we're going to have free college education and God knows what else. But if you look at where entitlements are going, you see that the commissions that oversee the trust funds, Social Security is supposed to go exhausted in 2034, Medicare in 2028. So one of the things that we worried about, I'm happy to have my colleagues contradict me, but I think we really were concerned about what I would call the social dimension of strategy, the willingness of the American people, first, that we've done a terrible job educating them on the situation, and second, in terms of making the case that some sacrifice is going to be needed. And what you see in terms of the CBO projections are the defense budget as a percentage of GDP, and it's not the only measure, declining to about 2.5% by the middle of the next decade. During the Cold War, against much greater threats in terms of their military potential, as Bob has pointed out, we averaged well over 6%. So we're again, less than 50% of the level of effort in terms of at least our economic resources that we devoted during the Cold War being projected against much greater threats in the years to come.
We've discussed a lot this afternoon about China, about Russia. I want to come back to another subject that's been front and center this past week, and that's Iran, with Secretary Pompeo just recently returning now from a week-long trip, rallying support among allies in the Gulf in particular, elsewhere, for this administration's counter-Iran strategy. News over the weekend that National Security Advisor John Bolton had requested options from the Pentagon last fall to conduct airstrikes against Iranian targets after some militants lobbed rockets into the embassy grounds, the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Roger, let me ask you, first of all, what's your take? First of all, how big is this threat from Iran, given the other threats we're talking about, and is the Defense Department positioned to deal with it, or the U.S. government more broadly?
So I'll go to the second. I think we are positioned, at least from a military standpoint, both in the form of presence and capability. I think what you see Pompeo doing is on far more on the diplomatic front. The story about National Security Advisor Bolton notwithstanding, I can't really comment on that. And the timing, of course, was interesting to us all when that leaked out and who was no longer Secretary of Defense. But the reality is, I think the military is in a position to deal with this and to deter Iran in a way it has been for some time. Carrier presence, that would be the one thing I would point to. In the past, it seemed to be you need to have a carrier in the Gulf in order to deter Iran, and we've kind of walked away from that thinking, which reinforces some of what I think Bridge and others have talked about, is our conventional small C approach to how we deter or operate in the Middle East doesn't have to be the way we're doing it today. Right? We may not need a carrier there to do it, but I just want to go back to one thing Andy said. So I think I've responded to the question, but we did a survey at the Reagan Institute, which we rolled out at the Defense Forum. Shameless plug here. But it's striking because it reinforced what Andy said, and I think what the Commission was wrestling with. We asked those polled to comment on kind of friend or foe. And nearly 40% of those polled viewed China as an ally or somewhat of an ally. So let me ask you, this is a challenge. This is an animating challenge for elected leaders and policymakers in town, which is, if this truly is the pacing threat, and I'm saying it's more urgent than you are, Bob, but I think the rest of us are on the same page. The American people are not prepared for that because they view this country, which we are saying we need to invest in a very robust fashion and change the strategy to address, as a friend or somewhat of an ally. And that is a huge challenge. Contrast that with the Middle East, and off the charts. Because the thinking of the past 17 years, the wars, the blood, the treasure, everything else, they think that's a pacing threat. And you look at, not the pacing threat, but the threat, and you look at the conduct of our the State Department, the Secretary of State, you look at what he spends his time on, you would think that the Middle East, Iran, is the number one national security challenge, not China, not Russia, or anything else.
Yeah. Well, Bridge, is it? I mean, given what this administration is in its timeline?
Well, actually, I think pretty much everything Roger said makes a lot of sense to me, and I think it's actually quite significant. I mean, Roger and I agree on a lot, but not everything. And the fact that he's saying, and I think that that's the kind of thing that, especially in this kind of a context of almost a debate where we have the different views, but that Roger's point about we can do the Middle East operations in a different way, and China is the basing threat. And I would say we're not going to just skedaddle from the Middle East, and that's not what the strategy says. We're not going to assume we're going to get out. We're going to have to, and that's where the rubber meets the road, though, is how do we actually do it, and how do we get the incentives right, and how do we get the political class to understand that? And I think Roger's absolutely right about that.
But I do think you're just to disagree because we're agreeing too much.
Right. Okay, sorry.
The strategy really had, particularly in the Middle East, said we should rely on allies. I mean, it was not we should, we will. It was built in terms of how you do near simultaneity or deter, and that was very. Seems to be shallow based on our review in terms of what we're really expecting from our allies. How much can they actually contribute? How much are we really going to operate, together? I mean, that seems to me,
I think just
pie in the sky thinking.
Let's get into that because I think it's important, and I'll relate to the fundamental point, which gets back to certainly my view that the main point is the military balance of kind of state military power. Terrorists can obviously do great harm to us, but only major states with arms with serious militaries can impose their views on the world in ways that ultimately, to Andy's point, change our way of life and diminish it. In that context, I think we do have, in a sense, and I hat tip to Evan Montgomery, some of his work on this, but I think, in a sense, the old way of war does work, and we don't need to deny the fait accompli against Iran, because if Iran takes over Bahrain or something like that, we'll get around to it, and it'll be the worst day they ever have. So in that context, Iran is much, much less of a threat. And I think, a lot of it is the malign influence stuff, which is a big issue in terms of stability and the terrorist threat, but I think is dealt with better by OSS kind of thing, State Department, et cetera. And I think one thing that's really important in this context is being such a hawk on Iran that you're willing to risk, or go to war. We have to be really careful that's not a gift that doesn't turn you into essentially a panda hugger, to use the phrase, right? Because if we get in another major Middle East war, and it's not really important, that is a massive gift in our competition with China, which is the decisive contest. And our military balance is crucial. And I think Andy's points are absolutely right. Maybe I take a slightly different counsel, but I say, and there are some friends from our allied countries here who hear me say this all the time, which is, at some point in this coming decade, the American people are going to have to face, and they're going to say, we're spending 3 to 4% of our GDP, and you're paying 1 to 1.5%. You get to send you get vacations, you get more hospital visits, and blah blah. And why are we defending you? You're perfectly capable of doing that. So we need to get ahead of that. And I think that's one of the least developed parts of the national defense strategy in terms of its implementation, is a different approach to allies. And it's not just you do more; it's you do more, and we're going to really bring you in, and you're going to understand, and we're going to be candid about the challenges that we face. The era of unipolarity is over. I think if you'd asked Donald Rumsfeld, but also if you'd asked Bill Cohen how important allies were, they might say it's nice to have the political context, but really, we'd rather just do it alone. It's a different world, and in the Middle East is going to be tough because of the state capability issue. But, in places like Europe and North Africa, or in places like South Asia, I think we're going to be relying, and that's going to be empowering for good or ill. I don't think we have another choice.
Bob?
Yeah, just to tie a couple things together. Look, you read the strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and in the first 2 paragraphs it says we're emerging from a period of strategic atrophy, and the last paragraph says it is my intent to seek urgent change at significant scale. And so what the department's view is that we have conventional overmatch right now against both China and Russia. But the trend lines are such as we could achieve they could achieve parity or even go slightly above us by 2023, 2024. So it's an urgent challenge. So whether you want to call it a crisis or an emergency, the department recognized this, and that's why they said we're in a technical competition. We're going to go into all of these different types of things. We have to go after operational concepts. On simultaneity, it says we're going to do one great power war. And that's code word for saying we are going to operate globally against either of these 2 great powers if push came to shove. We would be operating in multiple regions. So we have more than enough forces right now to handle North Korea and Iran simultaneously. Iran's conventional threat is far less than it's been in 20 years. They have nuclear weapons. That's the problem. So then you say, would deterrence hold?
North Korea, you mean?
North Korea, did what I say?
Iran.
Oh, North Iran. Yeah, North Iran, they're bad too.
Red line.
Second, Iran is not a conventional threat at all. If we went to war with Iran, we would crush them conventionally. But they are operating in the gray zone with proxies. And so, again, there are different ways to go about that problem. So conventionally, when you look at it, the conventional threats of North Korea and Iran are down. The conventional threats of Russia and China are rising. You have to completely reorient your force and op concepts to address those. And look, we had this debate for 3 years when I was in the department. What is the second thing? If North Korea went down, we were absolutely confident that we could keep the Straits of Hormuz open. We were absolutely confident, whether there was a carrier there or not. It might take us time, but we'd open it. So, again, this is about the department saying, this is what the department really said. Hey, for 17 years we've been focused on irregular warfare. We got to up our strategic game, and we better do it urgently. And so they didn't list all of the things that they had to do. It was just say, snap out of it, whap, 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 let's go. And in that regard, I thought it was very good. So $700 billion, well, actually 716, going probably to 733.
Inshallah.
Say you get to 733, that's an awful lot of money if you make the right choices.
So I just want to, Roger was kind enough to cede the floor to me. I just want to capture where we are. I think we have come completely full circle, which is it sounds like everybody is agreeing that there's a sense of urgency, that the department has done a great job in terms of laying out clearly the slap of we need to focus on these major state competitions, and now let's get ourselves in gear. That is essentially where the commission ended up as well, what the commission then said is, where is the department on its journey of discovery? We're concerned. That's the gist of it. I think there's absolutely perfectly reasonable room to disagree, and I'm sure there's a lot of disagreement on the particulars of capacity versus readiness versus modernization, where the modernization funds are going, what the department's priorities ought to be. The fact that the operational concepts were put in the classified version made it more difficult to talk forthrightly as a commission about that. We had a workaround. Andy has a different workaround, which I urge everyone to read as well in his annex. But however you work around it, we need to be focused in an unclassified public way on getting people to understand where those challenges are headed. And I think, as the commission report pointed out, there is notable continuity, just staying at the unclass level, from basically the Rumsfeld era and before to today. And that should alarm us that we have not sufficiently moved out in a lot of these same operational challenges. So I'll stop there.
We're going to go to your questions in just a moment, but I wanted to ask my final question to the panel, and that is, obviously, one of the major architects and main enforcer of the National Defense Strategy, Jim Mattis, is gone now. What do you all feel? I mean, how much institutional momentum is behind this? Does Patrick Shanahan have enough WASTA to kind of push this through, or will this be a problem with this strategy kind of waffles are a little in the middle here, or people start trying to take parts of it, both with Shanahan and General Milley coming in? Go ahead, and then we'll go to your questions.
Yes, I think he does. I mean, he knows more about the National Defense Strategy. He was central in working with Bridge, his Secretary Shanahan. He knows the decisions that were made, and I believe he's fully committed to it. And the question is, will the 2020 program? It was very interesting. 2020 was supposed to be the masterpiece. It was supposed to reflect the NDS from top to bottom. But I don't know if you saw it about 2 weeks ago. One of the senior leaders in the Air Force said, hey, 20 was kind of cooked. 21, it's fights on. Those were his words. And so it seemed to me that we've lost, if that's the case, we will have lost another year. And if we lose another year, maybe I will say we're in emergency. But I'm still urgent right now.
I'm skeptical. I think to really see changes in the defense program that makes sense, you have to have some sense of what the operational challenges are. What do you want the military to do? Okay. And even in the classified version, I wasn't particularly impressed. So, if if you don't tell them to do something different, they're going to do what they do. Second, even if you did tell them, suppose you said, well, one of the operational challenges is defending the first island chain and our allies and partners. Okay, that presumes that they're going to come up with a way of doing that. All right. Well, the way of doing that is probably not going to be it's going to be significantly, probably dramatically different from what we've been doing, which means it creates winners and losers. So you've got that problem. The losers are going to fight like hell, and they've got institutional and programmatic momentum behind them. So again, I'm very skeptical whether it's what is it, the masterpiece? The masterpiece. I'm a big fan of Masterpiece Theater. I'm waiting for the show, but I'm skeptical I'm going to see anything that resembles a masterpiece anytime soon.
Well, as on a number of occasions, I agree with what Andy's saying, but I think I take a different conclusion, which is I agree with you that these are enormous obstacles, all the more reason for a body like the Commission to have been clear. This is, I think, I agree with Kath at that level, at the national political conversation, clarity on the priorities. But what we need from other informed, really, I mean, there's hard to assemble a more distinguished group than these three and the rest of the Commission. But to say hard choices are necessary, we are going to do things differently. In the Middle East, we are not going to necessarily grow the force. I would say Pat Shanahan, I'm hopeful because he is, as Bob said, he was deeply involved. He really played a crucial role. I can say from personal experience, has always been a change agent. I kind of hate that term, but he really is a change guy. He's also, I think he's willing to go after some more sacred cows, than just somebody from central casting might, because he's an outsider. He's not a policy wonk. He's willing to look at things freshly. Obviously, he doesn't come with, the whole, sort of kit and caboodle that a Jim Schlesinger or somebody would have come with. But I think, and he's deeply committed to the NDS. I know that for a fact, and I think, and David Norquist, the acting deputy secretary, is very committed and very involved. So I think it's, and others, the Secretary of Defense may or may not understand all the operational concepts and be the actual driver. Ideally, the bulk of the department in uniform. Also, General Milley was also very involved in the NDS, and from what I understand, has been very supportive. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but the obstacles are significant.
And can we count on Congress the way Les Aspin or Sam Nunn orchestrated their reviews, 3 decades ago after the Persian Gulf War?
I think with Adam Smith as chairman, and that's the first place you have to go. My sense is on China, which we've all agreed is the most significant shift in this defense strategy. On the whole, I think he's on board. To the extent the strategy relies on modernizing our strategic capabilities, nuclear weapons and triad, there's going to be huge friction there, which he's been public about. But it's amazing. We've had this session here for over an hour. We're talking about whether this strategy is going to be executed, and we haven't talked about President Trump. My God, Shanahan doesn't matter about the, doesn't really, is irrelevant. I think the Congress, you argue, is irrelevant. It's all about what the president wants to do, and he is making choices, at least reported daily, considering choices that will take us in a dramatically different direction. Syria, Afghanistan, reports on NATO today that we pull out of NATO. I mean, if we move ahead, if he moves ahead in any of these directions, or some of them, Bob and I were just chatting about how committed is the president to China, as seeing that China is a pacing threat. Who knows? Trade deal gets resolved, security issues get resolved too in his mind. That is the most significant variable in whether this defense strategy truly sticks in a fashion that we all think it ought to.
Good. We're going to go to your questions.
Somebody asked about capacity.
I think what we're going to do here now is I'm going to call on folks. Please identify yourself and make sure there's a question mark at the end of your question. Yes, sir.
We're waiting for a microphone.
Yeah.
Right behind you.
Right here in front.
Sorry, take Sam as a grad.
Can you hear me?
Yes, no. I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council and Naval War College. This is a very informative panel, and thank you all very much. My question is going to relate to what does it take to defeat China in a war, but I want to offer three realities that I think are important. First, I would argue the greatest danger facing the Pentagon today is uncontrolled internal real cost growth of 3 to 5% a year. And Andy has sketched out some of the reasons. And so while the panel calls for 3 to 5%, that's not going to grow the force, and I don't believe it's going to be able to sustain the force, especially when you take a look at our economic situations here and our deficit, et cetera, et cetera. And I would argue you're going to see spending below 700 in the relatively small future. Secondly, I think we have under-exaggerated or under-assessed the weaknesses in both China and Russia. China has an underclass larger than the population of the United States. There's a real estate bubble. It's got all sorts of debt problems and probably over 100,000 riots a year. And so I think we need to look very, very carefully at the weakness of China, especially as its GDP is growing. The same thing applies to some degree in Russia. And third, Bob Gates famously said that any Secretary of Defense or President who wants to get engaged in a land war in Asia needs his head examined. So what's happened between now and then to change our focus? And so my question is, if Taiwan were to be taken over, I know Andy's got some strategies, what do we do to defeat China in a real war? And my answer is about 400 megatons.
Anybody want to take a grab at that?
Was there a question?
Defending Taiwan.
Whether we should do it or not.
So how are you going to do it? What's your strategy?
Well, I think that's what Bob mentioned. It's to sink the 350 ships, and that's not going to end it. But I mean, Andy would know better than I. But the operational problems to actually seizing and holding Taiwan, especially in the face of determined Taiwan resistance, is no easy problem. Okay.
By the way, every war game we did at Newport on both China and the Gulf, we do not come out well.
I would say, again, you need an operational concept that leads to a defense posture in that part of the world. And again, hopefully not too much self-promotion. I've written an extended study on something called archipelagic defense. It talks about defense of the first island chain. It calls for ground forces, and the Japanese are already well on their way to implementing big parts of this. Ground forces provide capability to deny the PLA what it says it needs to conduct an offensive campaign, which is air superiority, maritime superiority, and information superiority. So ground forces primarily focusing on air and missile defense and coastal defense, anti-ship cruise missiles. Like I said, the Japanese are already doing this. Our Army, I've been meeting with Deputy G3 and the Deputy Commander of Army Forces Pacific to talk about how our Army might begin to move in this direction. And what you have, without getting too military, is the Chinese advantage is interior lines, if you look at the geography. And that means we need to counter-concentrate. We need mobile forces that counter-concentrate. And that's why ground forces liberate air and maritime forces to counter-concentrate so they don't get a position of advantage anywhere along the chain. And so that's hopefully sufficient to deter. And you can get into issues of how do we break Chinese blockade of Taiwan or Japan, how do we conduct counteroffensive operations in places like Luzon and Palawan, and I'd be happy to talk about that after this session. But that's the sort of thing you need to make informed decisions about defense priorities.
Well, or can I just briefly, I would say, I think you can make your defense priorities. Those are the conversations that need to follow that the National Defense Strategy is specifically designed to catalyze.
Right over here.
Thomas Ernst from the German Embassy. I would like to cite half a sentence in your executive summary. It says, absent of a whole-of-government strategy, the US will not be able to revert the ascent of its rivals, or the momentum of its rivals, it said. I found it very enlightening when, I think Secretary Work said, we have never faced anybody who has had more than 40% of our GDP. And the way we are going, it won't be for a long time, but we will face parity elements in the future. So this whole-of-government approach and reversing the momentum is really the key, because most of the rivalry will be in a gray zone. It's not about winning a military war against China in the future. And the way I understood it, and that's my question, you have just pushed this idea of whole-of-government approach, oh, that's OSS, DOS, that's somebody else. So 733, maybe, billion are spent in the Department of Defense. But in my view, the real issue to tackle the problems of the gray zone competition as a whole-of-government approach, in your view, in the national defense strategy, is none of the business of the DOS, of the DoD. That somebody else should deal with that. How is that really realistic, or shouldn't you, in a national defense strategy, and I agree with this sentence, focus much more on this whole-of-government approach and strategy and how to do it, instead of saying that's somebody else's business?
Kath, you want to take a shot at that, or
Well, I think that may be in response to the comments
Yeah, I think
you
it was
two
me.
made
Yeah,
on
so
gray zone.
maybe,
Yeah.
Could I just, and Bob may, no, I mean, Admiral, I think it's a great question. I disagree with you in the sense, gray zone is important. And in a sense, the gray zone is particularly important in, including in the military competition, if countries can be, their calculus can be changed or their incentives can be changed, that can also change the military balance if they affiliate or deny us access or whatever. But I think the key premise that you stated that I fundamentally disagree with is that we would not have a war with China. If the Chinese believe that they have a rational course of action to threaten the use of military force, and including the actual employment of military force, that is not only going to become something that they would find more appealing in and of itself, but that is going to shape the behavior throughout the region and beyond. If take Taiwan as the most obvious example, if they are confident they could win a Taiwan contingency and tie it up, and everybody else knows that, and we know that, then they're likely to provoke a crisis. So all the stuff that we're doing in the information environment, that is important, and actually the information environment is particularly important for both the Russian and the Chinese theories of victory. I think what I'm saying, and I think what Bob's saying is, as a force planning criterion, force development criterion, the gray zone is not the pacing challenge. We may use some relatively subsidiary forces on that, but the fundamental focus of the U.S. Department of Defense has to be on being ready to fight and win in a plausible way over strategically significant scenarios. That's the fundamental criterion.
Yeah, I say on the commission, well, I don't think.
Want to be misunderstood.
Yeah.
It was not force planning I was talking about.
Or employment as well.
The strategic approach, and who is responsible developing those strategies, whole of government, for this gray zone. That, in my view, it should be the DoD, because it has the massive amount of funding, should also take on the responsibility. And I understood you that you kind of push this out of.
But I mean, if it's just because I think it's about me. If it's information, it shouldn't be the DoD. The DoD is not the best suited organization to being an information strategy or an intelligence strategy or a persuasion strategy. If money needs to be shifted to the State Department or something for that purpose, but a lot of it is about how you use our government resources, including our forces, but other instruments of government.
To build on what Bridge is saying, I agree with it. It's so again, this should be coordinated at the highest level. Coordinated. So that means the White House, the NSC, me, the NSC staff. It's the province of the State Department to cultivate and improve relationships. Let's just talk about China with countries like Japan, India, Australia, and so on. Countries that either have military capability or offer us positional advantage or other assets. Treasury, in terms of things like CSIS, in terms of Trans-Pacific Partnership, these are all things that can improve our competitive position and our underlying economy, as well as fiscal policy. And then social, as I think Rich was alluding to, when we have a country that thinks of China as an ally, when our political elites are saying China is becoming a danger, we've got a big problem. And I happen to work on something called Soviet military power for Secretary Carlucci at the end of the Cold War. That document was roundly criticized in American academic circles, but the target wasn't the American academics; it was the people of Europe. And how well are we doing in making the case not only to the American people, but to the people of our allies and partners, and also to the people of our competitors and rivals? And we are just, if you look at the early documents like NSC 68, 160, there is a lot of talk about propaganda, about social cohesion, and that's an afterthought if it's even a thought at all in terms. So that's the whole of government approach. These are the things that can't be done in the Defense Department. The Defense Department has to do its job, but these other institutions and arms of government have to do their job, and it's all coordinated, ultimately coordinated, not run and operated, but it's coordinated at the NSC.
One more quick comment. So
I just think there's a big role for DoD in the competition. So I don't disagree with Bridge and Andy's articulation of what some of the other agencies should do, but space, cyber, force presence, the way we position ourselves globally has to change dramatically, not just for the fight that may occur that Bridge is talking about, but to deter and address the competition that's going on right now. And the reality is that if we just continue doing things the way we're doing, there won't be a war to face because they would have already won, because they'll be in those capitals occupying. And I disagree with what Bridge said before, which is we'll get around to it, and I know he was referencing Evan's piece. I don't think our society, the present, current occupant or future occupant, will be willing to spill the blood or treasure to get around to it. So unless we take the competition more seriously, we could be a situation where we're not willing to do the things that we said we're going to do since World War II.
Yeah, this is how I would answer this. In the Cold War, national strategy was run out of the White House and the national security staff. And after the Cold War ended, the White House delegated grand strategy to the Department of Defense, to our enduring problem. We need to bring that back up to the White House. And when I first joined the Obama administration, I could not use the terms China and competition in the same sentence. I couldn't even say that we were in a competition because the Obama administration initially thought that the term competition was inherently negative, that it would inherently lead to bad things. To Roger's point, if you took a poll across the federal government outside DoD and you asked them, is China a strategic competitor that threatens the United States global position over the long run? I'm not certain how many would say they are. So to your point, we got to get it back up to the White House. We need to restart the interagency process, which, as near as I can tell, has completely ground to a halt. And we need to say, how will we compete globally in all elements?
I want to get to some other questions, so we can take this right here, please.
Thank you. My name is Ali Wine. I'm a policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. We've talked a lot today about great power competition as a central organizing analytical framework. And when I hear the word competition, I think one interpretation is that it's a statement of a condition. We have entered into an era of competition, or it's a means. We are competing to some end. What's less clear to me is what America's long-term strategic objective is with great power competition. So question one is, what is it that we believe is the end state of great power competition? And specifically vis-a-vis China, what long-term end state do we seek in that bilateral relationship? Thanks.
Well, I think actually the national security strategy, and that's what I was going to mention, and the national defense strategy are brief and telegraphic, but relatively clear. And Andy put his finger on it, which is an enduring interest, which is favorable regional balances of power in the key regions of the world. The national security strategy is quite clear about that, as is the national defense strategy. And that's basically to deny I think, as I understand it, deny a potential hegemon the ability to establish suzerainty or control, some degree of control over those regions, and be able to potentially project power, but also exclude us. And I think one of the points I always make in that respect is if China thinks that, for instance, our interests in Asia are relatively sort of ephemeral. Not only did the United States fight in World War II, but it fought the Spanish-American War. It had an open door policy. It had the black ships. Our interests are actually consistent in both theaters. We just never thought we needed it so much in Europe. But I think that's actually quite important, and that connects very clearly, I think, it's not always explicitly laid out, but in the National Defense Strategy, the mechanism to achieve the favorable balance of power is the alliance and partnership architecture. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be exactly the way it was in the past for it to be in the future, but that helps deal with the asymmetry of threat and so forth, and the fact that we're an external balancer. And then our military forces and our deterrent posture is designed to fortify countries' confidence, and that's, if you look at the Indo-Pacific strategy, these are all signals designed in substantial part to send a signal to countries in the region that they can take steps to defend their own interests and also affiliate with us. One thing I would just briefly say on Bob's point, because I think it's apropos, is I was actually struck in the national security strategy process by how broad the consensus was on China, and I think Bob and others deserve a lot of credit actually for changing people's views and putting the government on that. But I think even in places like the Treasury, I don't think there are huge pockets of people making the Bob Rubin, Hank Paulson style argument. It's really people across the board. The American business community now understands what IP theft, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there has been a shift, even if what Roger's saying is true. It might be different segments of society that have different views.
Question right here.
Thank you. I'm Steve Grundman. I have two questions, and the first is, I feel like Kath has about three things in her mind's queue to tell us, and I'd ask you to reveal at least one of them, even at the expense of the answer to my question, which is leverage. When I pick up a strategy document, it could be the National Defense Strategy, it could be a corporate strategy, it could be a homeowners association. I look for at least two things in particular. Does the objective have clarity, and is it to some degree tractable? But the other is the basis of my question. What's the leverage in this strategy? What is the thing which either innately or by investment or otherwise, the enterprise is going to use to gain advantage over the other guys who have a lot of the same, in this case, we've said, in this instance, a lot of the same resources, be they economic or even technological, that we will have. So where are we going to get leverage? And I don't see that either in the Commission report or in the National Defense Strategy. There was a play for it, certainly in the third offset strategy. It said that lever is technology. I wonder if that's actually the right lever. Maybe it is, Bob. But that's my question to the panelists. Where's this society going to get leverage in this competition?
If you're talking about...
But not at the expense of Kath.
Oh.
And her
you want to go first?
We'll start with Kath and then go to...
I'm going to have the biggest glass of Chardonnay tonight. All right. I'm going to do you two first, Steve. I'll start on your second question. I think the NDS deserves credit for pointing to one of the biggest asymmetries and the biggest leverage points we have, and Bridge just talked about it again, which is our allies in the Alliance and Partner Network. And we do talk about give credit to the NDS and to Secretary Mattis for the emphasis on that in our commission report. I do think there's some other obvious areas to go, which again I think are at least leitmotifs in both documents, which are about our operational strengths, our asymmetries, so subsurface warfare. There are others, but let me just say stealth, et cetera. There are some substantial strengths operationally to build on, and then I think both give due attention to quality of military personnel and the innovation potential of American society. Those are some that I would start on. I did want to get back to this idea of capacity because it came up a couple of times, and again, there's something going on here that I think is not clear exactly to me what the tension is about, but let me just talk a little bit as one of the Democrats, the only Democrat on this panel on the commission. and where we sort of came from my perspective on capacity. The challenge we faced, and we speak very clearly to this in our recommendations about what the department should invest itself in terms of its own analytic capability, is the analysis that we looked at for the department did not in any way demonstrate a way in which to decrease capacity and achieve the objectives. And the objectives in the force sizing sense were to defeat and to deter in 2 theaters simultaneously, nearly simultaneously, roughly in the same time, and however you want to define it. We were never satisfied that the department had an answer to that question in general, and that was a problem for us. And then to the capacity issue, we certainly weren't satisfied that the department could point to areas where it could significantly trade off capacity. Now, I hold out the belief that there are areas, and this is why I come back to the issue that I think Andy also has, for different reasons, on operational concepts and rethinking how we fight. If we're going to be able to trade off capacity, boy, have we got to rethink how we're doing things, right? Unmanned, you name it, on many things that Bob spoke quite eloquently about as the deputy in sense. So I think that's the real challenge to the department. I'm ready to trade off anything, frankly, to get ourselves positioned to best strength and best capability in these competitions. And I don't have a principled view that we must have capacity, but I will tell you there is no analysis I have seen from the Department of Defense or elsewhere that demonstrates how to do what is called for in the defense strategy to include deterring in one theater, let's say that's Europe, while defeating in another theater, let's say that's Asia, at less capacity than it's currently planning. And that is why the Commission is so concerned that the ends, ways, and means are not aligned right now.
Yeah, I would say, based on the question, we have 5 existing or prospective sources of leverage or advantage. One is allies. We have the world's either first or second largest economy in ourselves. Japan number 3. I think Germany's number 4. So the potential is there, and that's a great source of potential advantage. Second, position. We have the world's best global basing structure, and that gives us positional advantage. Range. By the way, our advantage in position is declining, obviously, as China begins to place stones in this great board of Weiqi. Range, we traditionally, long-range precision strike was an enormous advantage. I think that advantage is dissipating. I don't see our Navy upping their game in terms of range. Air Force with B-21, hopefully they'll get it. And then 2 other things. And Bob talks about offset strategies. And I often think about if there is an offset strategy or something like that, the time frame we ought to look at or the analog is the interwar period, the period between the 2 world wars where there are multiple great powers. And as the point was made, a lot of the technology that was underlying military capability was occurring out of the commercial sector. You could get it if you had the money. And the advantage went to those militaries that could figure out how best to translate this general military technology into forces and capabilities that gave them competitive advantage. So everybody could get a radio, everybody could build a tank, everybody, but it was the Germans that figured out how to put it together in blitzkrieg. So again, it gets you back to the operational concept. What's the new way of fighting? What's the new next big thing in warfare that these technologies are going to enable us to do? And then the final source of advantage, which we used to have, particularly back in that period, which we totally are horrible at today, is the ability to compete based on time. Not only figuring out what the next big thing is, but being able to execute it faster than your rivals in an era of dynamic change. So those are 5 either existing or prospective sources of advantage, I think, that we have and ought to develop. And I think, again, you'd like to see something like that in a strategy, because at the heart of strategy is identifying, developing, and exploiting advantage.
If you go all the way in the back.
Hi, Christine Wormuth. I'm with the RAND Corporation. Thank you all. This was fascinating and quite a bit more peppy than the average DC panel. You've all emphasized emphasize the criticality of making hard choices. And in my own experience, I am more profoundly discouraged about the department's ability to do that. And just the question about whether Acting Secretary Shanahan has the wasta to sort of get it done, I think is revealing. I wonder if to make the kinds of profound changes urgently and on the scale that Secretary Mattis talked about in the NDS, we need to do something different in a more serious way. And I just wonder what your thoughts are, and I also wonder whether it's connected in any way to the one other topic that the Commission wrote about that we haven't addressed here today, which is the issue of the relationship between the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Staff in the building.
Dum, dum, dum.
It's you, Kat.
Nope, I'm not going to touch that. Look, since I would say as a general rule, since Secretary Gates, through a wide variety of reasons that I could go into over a long period of time, the balance between the senior leadership below the Secretary's level, so the ones who would exert oversight over the development of the defense program, has weakened significantly. There's a lot of reasons for it, and it is something that needs to be addressed. And I think it can be addressed, but basically what we have to do is we have to start bringing in more talent, civilian talent, into the department. And I don't know why anyone would go into the department right now, which is a big, big, big problem. So you have a joint staff that's 100% full up. The brightest guys in the department are going to the joint staff, and we just don't have the same level of attention to talent coming into the department for a wide variety of reasons. And so right now it is a problem. I think Mara Carlin writes about this a lot, and I think generally she's on the right track, and it needs to be addressed. To your point, though, on the capacity versus capability, this is one of the reasons why I just instinctively. It explicitly says we're going to grow. We should grow the Army. We should grow the Navy. Now, I couldn't really tell. It said the Air Force needs to have more bombers, more space, more lift, but it didn't say the Air Force needs to grow. So I thought that you were arguing for rebalancing inside the Air Force. It said the Marine Corps should stay at the same size. And look, I will tell you right now, death and taxes, here's the deal. Somebody brought it up. The cost of manpower increases above the rate of inflation every year. It's cooked into the law. We have to give a pay raise that's above inflation. So it will be above inflation. CBO says that the average sailor, soldier, airman, Marine by 2030 will cost $217,000. You must go to unmanned systems. There is absolutely no other way we will be able to have a force with the capacity necessary to do this unless you go. So I'd be giving up capacity right now to save money on the personnel side and to really make this broad shift that would make us more competitive over time.
Real quick, I mean, the recommendation, just to contextualize it, it was for near to midterm force priorities. So it's talking about the FIDA, in essence, okay? And Kath hit on the tension perfectly, which responds to your question. Give us an alternative. Bob's articulated, we got to go unmanned, right? Now, that's appropriate for a Washington midday policy conversation. You'd expect a little bit more out of Department of Defense analysts. And the answer is, we didn't get more. So the tension we felt was, are we really going to let go of what we have now in favor of something we can't even articulate and don't even know if what you're going to tell us to go unmanned is actually we have a framework for how we're going to defeat the adversary? Not once were we actually given what that looks like. So you're telling us to give that up and make a choice? No way. We held on to that tight. The compromise was to put it within the FIDA. 2020 or 2021, I mean, this is the role for the Congress right now. If they can't come forward and offer a defense program that offers an alternative, then the grade they get for executing the defense strategy should be an F. If it's more of the same, then it's the previous regime, right? It's Ash Carter's strategy, because nothing's new. They would not be offering anything new. That's the test. This commission couldn't responsibly put forward new capabilities, new investments, or say reduced capacity, because we didn't have anything we could identify and say, yes, that's the way to go.
I'm going to, we've run out of time, but I'm going to have Bridge as our host here from CNAS is going to have just a few closing comments before we
I'm
wrap
going to
up.
steal the prerogative of the host to make a few substantive points. And I think Roger's point, I agree in the sense of Secretary Shanahan has promised a masterpiece. It should deliver exactly what you're saying. Whether it's going to happen, I don't know. And I think to Christine's point, I mean, I think we're all skeptical. But that means every single instrument that we have, we should enable the hard choices. That's one of the things we're thinking about a lot about here. My sense personally, and this is where I think the Commission was really right, was to be candid about the threat. Because if you look at the ultimate factor, I think it's an insufficient perception of the threat on the part of the political class, including in the Congress and the influencers out there. Not to say that we're always right, that we should not be alarmist, but that people don't understand that our military advantages are eroded. The NDS, even though Secretary Mattis hated to advertise weakness, he was very clear that the American military advantage has been eroded. But I think Bob had the right policy when he was really talking about this, because the Russians and the Chinese know about this a lot more than the American people do. And I think that's something that we. Final point on the Civ Mill thing. It's obviously an issue, as the Commission rightly pointed out. I think just a broader point is, you know, especially when you are dealing with nuclear-armed adversaries who are going to be whole-of-government competitors, the notion that the civilians can be confined to a very, very high level of strategic ends and stuff, I think is honestly risible. Civilians need to be put in particular to make sure that we maintain essentially an apolitical senior military class. There is not a sustainable model where military officers make the decisions and set the options and so forth for the President of the United States, either this one or a future one, and that doesn't ultimately lead to a politicization of the senior officer class. I'm confident of that. And if that's the future, then that's not going to be good. I agree with Bob. We need the civilians to be involved. It's going to be a back and forth. It's going to be a contact sport, but civilians need to be involved. And then, of course, there are boundaries there too. But I think we can get to a better place, especially when you're dealing with adversaries with nuclear forces and so forth. Just on an institutional note, I want to thank everybody for coming today on behalf of CNAS. Particularly want to thank our panelists. I think some of them were a little bit surprised by the vigor of the discussion. That is actually, as I was saying to Dave Deptula beforehand, we don't want to have your typical panel. We want you to have something interesting where you get discussion that you might learn something that you didn't already know. I think we achieved that wonderfully today. I think we're all friends up here, so it's all business. But this is exactly what I hope to achieve, and I don't think this conversation had yet, so I hope you feel the same way. I hope you'll join me in thanking the other panelists.